This lecture 2 is meant to accompany reading 1, which is actually chapter 12 in an Introduction to Anthropology textbook that I wrote on religions. This treatment of religions will be a bit more general and done at a little bit lower level than the next reading 2. My point here is to hit some of the highlights of the chapter. Of course, the entire chapter is assigned for you, and everything there is important, but my intent here is to hit some of the high points of the chapter. First, there's a discussion of the definition of religions. Edward Tyler gave us one of the earliest definitions of religion, a belief in spiritual beings, which seems reasonable and valid enough until you discover that, in fact, there are some major world religions, namely Buddhism, Jainism, and Taoism, that don't worship God or gods. With Buddhism, a slight qualification is needed. Theravada Buddhism is the form of Buddhism that doesn't recognize the Buddha as the divine figure, and so therefore they don't worship God or gods. So there's a bit of a problem with that definition. Paul Tillich comes along a little bit later, the 20th century, a Protestant theologian, and gives us a definition. Religion is ultimate concern. So whatever an individual is ultimately concerned with is their religion. Well, some critics immediately pointed out that which many people are ultimately concerned with can be rather trivial. For example, gambling. A person may be a gambling addict, devotes all their time and energy to gambling. A person may be a football nut, right? A person may be a fan of the Third Reich in Germany in 1939, which would make them a Nazi. So is Nazism a religion? Well, Paul Tillich answered his critics by saying that if what an individual is ultimately concerned with is a worldly endeavor, then it is strictly idolatrous and not actually a religion. So that's how he deals with that. Toward the end of that discussion, you will read the definition that I put forth. And it reads like this: religion is a coherent system of culturally patterned symbols, practices, and ideology that serves as a medium whereby cultural conceptions of the paranormal aspects of human existence might be expressed. A couple of important things about that definition. First of all, you see the term culture, or at least one of its forms, used twice, which emphasizes the cultural sort of geographical specific aspect of religion. Religions are very much cultural endeavors, and that's because we're looking at religion as a global phenomenon. You'll also note that I avoid the term supernatural, or I avoid alluding to the supernatural, and that's because there are a number of problems with the term supernatural. First, there are many cultures that do not recognize the existence of a supernatural. To them, everything is unity. It's just one holistic existence. There is no supernatural and natural distinction like we have here in the West. Second problem is that it may possibly be simply the product of human imagination. And James Lett comments on that, and I encourage you to read his comments. It is true that we have zero data for the existence of the supernatural. And so one could, I think, quite rightly argue that it's a nonsensical term. So anyway, I avoid the problems with the term supernatural by using the term paranormal, which just signifies something a bit beyond the normal. and we're on much safer ground there, I think. Next, I mentioned that religion, and again, remember, I'm just picking up on some of the highlights in the chapter. Religion has the luxury of escaping the harsh light of criticism. This was addressed a bit in Lecture 1. And the reason why is because the claims and beliefs and dogmas of the world's religions can't be tested. So they are classically non-falsifiable. So they stand the test of time not because they're necessarily valid, but simply because they can't be tested or critiqued. Next, I discuss the beliefs of the world's religions. Of course, there are 10,500 of them, as I mentioned in Lecture 1. And virtually all of the major beliefs of the world's religions, not only are they not falsifiable, but they're mutually contradictory. And this pertains to what the religions are saying about God or gods, what religions are saying about the afterlife, what religions are saying about how humans should comport themselves, what religions say about the meaning and purpose of life, the various creation stories, scenarios. All the religions are mutually contradictory in this regard. In other words, as I mentioned in Lecture 1, there is virtually no consensus among the world's religions on these various issues. Next, I talk about Durkheim, who is Emil Durkheim, a French sociologist who did a lot of his writing in the 1920s and 30s. And even though he is an atheist, he wrote, quote, "There are no religions which are false," unquote. Now that seems like an awful odd thing for an atheist to say. But you have to understand that Durkheim was a sociologist. And not only that, he was a functionalist. So how can he say that there are no religions which are false? In other words, all religions are true. How could he say that? Well, what he means is that they're all true in regard to their functionality. Right? So in their given context, all these religions work to the people who embrace them. That's all he means. It's an interesting, very modern way to look at religions. In fact, the anthropology of religion is largely functional. We look at the functionality of religions in the various cultures, and we don't pay much attention to claims made about God or gods or the supernatural, since these cannot be tested anyway. Then I discuss a couple of laws of religion. The first is that religions tend not to spread outside their area of origin. That is due to their cultural specific nature. So religions tend to stay in the area where they originated. Two major exceptions to this law are Christianity and Islam, but as you read in the text, and please do read through this carefully, Christianity and Islam spread primarily as a result of a mass movement of a highly armed, technologically advanced, organized people who had the power to subjugate people as they encountered them and force their religion on those who they subjugated. So those two exceptions are pretty easy to understand. However, the one interesting exception is Buddhism, because Buddhism also spread, beginning in Northeast India, spreading first southward to Sri Lanka, then to extreme Southeast Asia, and then north from there up to China, Tibet, Mongolia, and then finally out to the Koreas and Japan. But it did so primarily on the strength of its ideology. In other words, there was no mass movement of peoples. There was virtually no violence involved, which makes Buddhism rather special in this regard. One interesting aspect of this spread of ideas has to do with redundancy, and it's one of the ways we can understand why it's so difficult to spread religious ideas. Of course, redundancy has to do with the repetitive quality of something. So in other words, if you're going to spread a religious idea outside of its area of origin, you're going to have to really pound this idea into people over and over and over, probably use power, your power or some sort of force to do so. Well, contrast that with the ideas of science. For example, Newton's laws of motion, Kepler's law of planetary motion, Boyle's law, the Pythagorean theorem. These ideas require virtually no redundancy because they can be demonstrated to be valid irregardless of a person's cultural or religious background. So that's one way to understand why religious ideas are so difficult to spread. It has to do with this redundancy idea. They require so much more redundancy than other ideas. Well, and don't forget, religions are making claims about some other dimension that supposedly exists that we can't access, right? So actually what they're doing is difficult. Science is just making science comments just on the world we live in. Another law of religion has to do with the fact that if one knows the geography and the circumstances of a person's birth, then they can quite likely determine the religion of that individual if they are religious, right? So simply, people tend to worship the way others around them do, simply by virtue of their birth, which means you can take the very same person who is a Muslim in Egypt and 20 years old today, and if you could put that 20-year-old, that same person, in Thailand, and today they could very well be a Theravada Buddhist. Or you put them in Louisiana, and that same person would be Christian. A couple of characteristics of the anthropological approach to religions. First, cultural relativism, that was discussed in Lecture 1. A very important ideological tool used by people studying religions and anthropology. Simply put, once again, we assume that no one culture serves as the standard by which others are judged. So that forces us to go into the study of every religion on an equal basis, right? Not with the intent of comparing them to see which is better or worse, right? But rather just to learn about them, what makes them tick. Another aspect of the anthropological approach to study of religion is that it's considered that all the claims and dogmas and beliefs of the world's religions are non-falsifiable. In other words, there are no tests that can be designed. There's no data that can be brought to bear when it comes to claims of veracity or falsity of these religions. They simply can't be tested. And in fact, I mean, it should be pretty obvious to you, that's why the concept of faith exists in religion, whereas, for example, in science, there's no room for faith. In fact, there's no need for faith in science. You either prove your point empirically or you don't. But with religion, faith is used in place of the fact that, well, in recognition of the fact that these things cannot be tested in our world. Finally, the anthropological approach to study of religion is agnostic. In other words, no assumptions are made regarding the existence of God or gods, or the truth or falsity of their religious claims, since none of these things can be determined anyway due to their non-falsifiability. Therefore, anthropologists focus on the doing of religion in this world. In other words, how does religion function in this particular culture? Next, I discuss a variety of different forms of religion. Of course, you can read about them all. They're all important. A couple of the more noteworthy ones, deism. Deism is the notion that there is a creator God, but that this God does not intervene in the affairs of the world. So in other words, the world operates according to strictly natural principles. Also, deists don't recognize scriptures, miracles, revelation. They don't go to church. They don't pray, and so forth, since it's thought that God is totally withdrawn. Interesting fact, quite a few of the founding fathers were deists. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, a few of them. Agnosticism refers to the mindset whereby one neither believes nor disbelieves in the existence of God. There are different forms of agnosticism that you can read about there. Atheism, of course, you put a in front of a term, it means not that. So a not theist, in other words, a person who disbelieves in the idea of God. And then animism, the notion that all things of the world, even inanimate things like the planets, the moon, sun, rivers, trees, mountains, are imbued with a spiritual essence of some sort. Many tribal indigenous religions are animistic. For example, Native American religions and Sub-Saharan African religions. There are three functions of religion. First is the cognitive function. This has to do with using religion to understand our world. Now, please note that the cognitive function was way more popular a few centuries ago than it is now, because today we use primarily science to understand our world, although some people still use the cognitive approach. But science has largely supplanted the cognitive function in this regard, especially since the age of reason and the Enlightenment. The existential function has to do with the emotional side of religion. It helps people deal, religion gives people, for example, a meaning and purpose, helps us deal with the anxiety of dying, and so forth. That's the existential function. And then finally there's the social function, which is religion functioning as a form of fellowship. And that's important for a lot of individuals. It gives them a sense of community. Today, the existential function, no doubt, is probably the most popular of these three, followed by the social, and then the cognitive to some small extent. The three categories of religion. The first category are the greater world religions. This terminology is reserved for only 11 of the world's religions. And the reason why we call them the great or world religions is because they are significant demographically. In other words, they're very large, lots of people. They're significant historically, or they're significant culturally. At least one of those three has to apply. The next category of religion are the tribal and indigenous religions. These are religions that are generally autochthonous. You see that word in your readings. In other words, they are strictly confined to one place and one people and stay that way. They tend to be non-literate in that they don't have a written corpus of beliefs and practices. and they are also the oldest religions on earth. And then finally there's the alternative religions, and these are religions that have at best a loose relationship to other religions and that have originated relatively recently. For example, Scientology, Mormonism, Wicca are three examples. And the last section of the reading is devoted to shamans. Shamans are the most ancient religious functionaries in the world. So they were the very first priest, quote unquote, although priest is something different. Shamans claim to have the unique ability to actually visit the spirit world and have an audience with the spirits, and then come back to this world to counsel people who need healing and help and so forth.